Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Tamiko Brown-Nagin, Dean of the Harvard-Radcliffe Institute, and I'm pleased to welcome you to our annual Julia S. Phelps Lecture in the Arts and the Humanities, this year featuring acclaimed historian Gary Gerstle, entitled America's Authoritarian Turn. Before I introduce this afternoon's speaker, let me first reflect on the history of the Phelps Lecture series. Julia Phelps, for whom the series is named, was a Radcliffe College alumna and a beloved teacher in Harvard's German department at the Harvard Extension School and here at Radcliffe. When Julia retired, her family, friends, and colleagues established this lecture in her honor. We're grateful for their support, which has enabled us to welcome distinguished writers, artists, and scholars to Radcliffe each year. I'm delighted that Julia's daughter and son-in-law, Susan Phelps Napier and Stephen Coit, are here this afternoon. Welcome. Finally, let me acknowledge the members of the Radcliffe Institute Leadership Society and all our annual donors whose generosity keeps Radcliffe programming free and open to the public, and we thank you. Today's lecture is also presented as a part of Radcliffe's initiative on academic freedom and connecting across difference, which we launched last year. This multi-year effort strives to ensure academic freedom, the freedoms to teach, learn, and conduct research through interdisciplinary insights and constructive dialogue. In pursuing these aims, Radcliffe is working alongside others from across the university engaged in related efforts to address the challenges of our time. I was honored to co-chair with Professor Eric Bierbaum, Harvard's Open Inquiry and Constructive Dialogue Working Group, which released its findings and recommendations this past October. As the report notes, the modern university promotes ancient and enduring ideals, the pursuit of truth, the creation and transfer of knowledge across generations, and the use of knowledge to improve society, spur innovation, and fortify democracy. Open inquiry and constructive dialogue, we concluded, are foundational to excellence in all of these endeavors. These core principles and ideals of higher education are especially salient as we consider the global state of democracy. As a noted scholar and senior fellow at the Brookings Institution wrote in 2022, democratic systems require the free flow of information and healthy civic discourse. Without the means to question authority and work free of fear, it becomes easy for countries to slide into illiberalism or outright authoritarianism. In recent years, scholars and international organizations have warned of such democratic erosion worldwide. For instance, the Varieties of Democracy Institute at the University of Gothenburg found that in 2023, democratization is taking place in 18 countries, while 42 countries are in ongoing episodes of autocratization. The Institute further noted that the proportion of the world's population living in autocracies has grown from 50% in 2003 to 71% in 2023. In his lecture today, Gary Gerstle will bring an historical lens to bear on these contemporary trends to examine authoritarianism and democratic fragility in and beyond the United States. Gary is the Paul Mellon Professor of American History Emeritus and Paul Mellon Director of Research in American History at the University of Cambridge. This year, he holds the Joy Foundation Fellowship at the Radcliffe Institute. A distinguished historian of modern America, Gary is the award-winning author of numerous books, including American Crucible, Race and Nation in the 20th Century, and Liberty and Coercion, The Paradox of American Government from the Founding to the Present. His most recent book, The Rise and Fall of the Neoliberal Order was shortlisted for the 2022 Financial Times Business Book of the Year, among other accolades. In this book, he tracks the ascent and dissolution of what he calls the neoliberal political order, raising the question of what new political movement might emerge from the polarization and social strife of the recent past. In addition, Gary has written for distinguished popular media outlets, and he frequently appears on the BBC, NPR, and podcasts. He is a fellow of the British Academy and a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Following his remarks, Gary will be joined in conversation by Beverly Gage, who is the John Gaddis Professor of History at Yale University. An expert in modern American political history, Beverly is the author of the books The Day Wall Street Exploded, A Story of America in Its First Age of Terror, and G-Man, J. Edgar Hoover and the Making of the American Century, which received the 2023 Pulitzer Prize for Biography and the Bancroft Prize in American History, among many other awards. After Gary and Beverly's conversation, we'll open the floor to audience questions. Whether you're joining us in person or online, you can submit your questions at any time using the Slido link that is provided on the screen behind me and posted in the chat feature of the Zoom webinar. I want to thank Gary and Beverly for being here today, and now please join me in warmly welcoming Gary Gerstle to the stage.
This is not my mic. You can hear me? Good. Beverly Gage thought that was my best Mussolini pose. So that partially made my day. And the other thing that made my day was the sign on the entrance to Knaufel, which said, "Welcome to America's authoritarian turn." Thank you to Miko for those wonderful words of introduction. Thank you to Beverly Gage for making the trip from Yale to be in conversation with me after my remarks. A few other thank yous are in order to the Harvard-Radcliffe Institute, the fellows, the administrative staff, the technical crew. Anyone who's come within their orbit knows how splendid they are. Harvard-Radcliffe has been a wonderful landing spot for me this year and has given me just what I needed to resettle in the United States after 10 years reading and teaching American history in Britain. And I thank, finally, my two Harvard undergraduate research partners who are sitting over in the corner there and raising their hands, Katie Lynn and Luka Pavicevic. They have had a significant hand in shaping what I am going to talk about today. So thank you very, very much. On January 6, 2021, thousands of Trump partisans rushed the Capitol from an ellipse nearby where their leader had given an incendiary speech. Trump had implored his people to stop Congress from certifying the votes of the Electoral College and thus halt the transition of power from him to Joe Biden. Now they were attempting to do so. No president prior to Donald Trump had ever encouraged an assault on the seat of popular government that it was his constitutional duty to protect. At the Capitol, Trump supporters fought and overwhelmed police, breaking through windows and doorways and streaming wildly through hallways. They were hunting, in particular, Vice President Mike Pence, whom Trump had accused of betrayal, and Democratic Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi, long a focus of MAGA rage. Pelosi had managed to escape the building, but Pence was still there, sequestered with his family in a downstairs room that the Secret Service desperately hoped the mob would not find. One group of assailants tried to force its way into the House chamber, with congressmen and congresswomen still inside. They were stopped temporarily by a Capitol policeman who shot and killed a protester trying to launch herself through a barricaded set of doors. Even as the danger to members of Congress became clear, Trump ignored pleas from administration officials, media pals, and even his own family members to instruct his supporters to stand down and to call on the National Guard and the Army to defend the Capitol and the people inside. He was implacable for 3 long, endless hours. Wanting the assault to succeed, he refused to act. Only then did he tell his supporters to stand down. Only then did National Guard troops regain control of the People's House. By this time, 140 police officers had been injured. 4 of them, traumatized by the fighting and the beatings they suffered, subsequently committed suicide. The Justice Department arrested 1,600 individuals for storming the Capitol that day. More than 800 pleaded guilty, and another 200 were convicted. Among those convicted were men who attacked police with wasp and hornet spray, who plunged an electroshock weapon into an officer's neck, and who pummeled a cop with reinforced brass knuckle gloves. Once upon a time, we could interpret this assault on the Capitol as a rogue event, out of keeping with American politics, led by the most roguish of figures who had temporarily hijacked American politics. That seemed the message to be gleaned from the 2020 election, when Joe Biden and his Democratic Party, backed up by the greatest number of voters ever to cast ballots in a US presidential election, ejected the authoritarian Trump from the White House. But the man who facilitated this assault on the Capitol has now been returned to office. If he serves out as his full second term, as I expect him to, Trump will have dominated politics for 12 years, 2017 to 2029, a longer span than any other president in American history other than Franklin Delano Roosevelt himself, president from 1933 to 1945. In other words, Trump's opportunity to put his stamp on America and its politics now rivals that of FDR himself. One of Trump's first acts upon returning to office was either to pardon every one of those convicted for actions on January 6th or to commute their sentences to time served. Many exited prison in high spirits, flaunting their lack of remorse, quickly declaring their intention to exact revenge from those who had done them harm and presumably ready to serve their leader should he deem a future assault on his political enemies necessary. I have heard the argument, as many of you have, that Kamala Harris was foolish to focus her campaign on January 6th and the future of American democracy, that the real issue in this election was the cost of food and gasoline and the Trump promise to bring the price of both down. That line of reasoning brings to mind those who in 1930s America were drawn to Mussolini because they had heard that he had made the trains in Italy run on time. We should not ignore the obliviousness to the future of democracy bound up in these sentiments. As many have been asking, should the price of eggs be the primary issue when the constitutional basis of the American Republic is at stake? About a year ago, in an interview with Time magazine, Trump gave us a glimpse of his own thinking on the question of whether Americans had become oblivious to democracy and whether they would flock to a presidential candidate flaunting authoritarian aspirations. Near the interview's end, the Time magazine correspondent, Eric Cortellessa, asked this of Trump. You said in a town hall discussion with Sean Hannity several months ago that you only want to be dictator for a day. What did you mean by that? Oh, Trump responded, that was just a joke. Going on to say that every person present at the town hall knows that, his words, he was just having a bit of fun. Cortellessa pressed on, asking Trump, do you see why so many Americans see language like that, dictator for a day, suspending the Constitution, as abruptly cutting Cortellessa off, Trump retorted, I think a lot of people like it. Let's parse Trump's words. I think a lot of people like it. What exactly did Trump mean by Americans liking it? What was it? That Trump had turned a query from Hannity about him wanting to become dictator into a joke that generated laughs? Or more plausibly, that he was suggesting that many Americans actually liked the idea of him becoming a dictator for a day or maybe more? However objectionable one might find Trump, one should never underestimate his shrewdness and his ability to read the political moment. Rather than blaming the legacy media or social media for not accurately reporting on Trump's wild claims, for not condemning his trafficking and misinformation, and for minimizing his threat to democracy, perhaps it's time to consider what Trump himself put front and center, namely that those Americans drawn to him understood what he was offering, that they shared his belief that American democracy had become a mess, that they accepted his claim that the American political system could not be fixed through ordinary mechanisms made available by the Constitution, and that a strong man for a day, a month, a year, a presidential term or more was just what America needed to set things right. I have three aims in my talk today. First, I will offer you some evidence to suggest that large and varied groups of Americans have indeed lost confidence in their democracy. Second, I will look for the roots of that loss of confidence in the 1990s and 2000s, when a powerful but unregulated system of global capitalism upended the livelihoods and lives of millions. And third, I will ask why, when the failures of this punishing economic system became manifest following the global financial crash of 2008-2009, the political fury that erupted across the ensuing decade largely favored authoritarian remedies rather than democratic ones. First part, what is the evidence that a crisis of democracy, of confidence in democracy, is gripping America? Consider this poll taken in June 2024 by the Pew Research Center. Pew asked this question of those it surveyed: which statement comes closest to your view? A, democracy in America is a good example for other countries to follow. B, democracy in America used to be a good example for other countries to follow, but has not been in recent years. C, democracy in America has never been a good example for other countries to follow. A mere 19% of those surveyed chose option A, democracy in the US is a good example for other countries to follow. A whopping 80% said democracy in America used to be or had never been a good example for other countries to follow. In short, in June 2024, 4 out of 5 Americans surveyed gave their democracy a failing grade. A poll conducted by the New York Times in January 2025 yielded even darker conclusions. Its chief finding: 88% of American adults believe that America's political system is broken. 9 out of 10 Americans believe America's political system is broken. There was virtually no difference in the polling of Democrats and Republicans on this issue. These polls did not measure change over time, but other polls have, registering a 21st century decline in the regard that Americans have for their democracy. The steepest drop has occurred among the young, perhaps because they are having difficulty identifying a period in their own lifetimes when American democracy could be said to have functioned well. I have recently been constructing stories of democratic disillusionment among individual Americans. Here's a glimpse of one story I've been developing pertaining to a young man whose name will be familiar to you, Luigi Mangione, the lone wolf who on December 4th, 2024, assassinated United Healthcare executive Brian Thompson in cold blood in front of a swank hotel in Midtown, New York City. In 2016, Luigi Mangione seems to have been comfortably mainstream. Born into a wealthy and politically prominent Maryland real estate family, he had excelled at a posh private high school in Baltimore. There was no hint of anger or disillusionment with American society in the platitudinous valedictory address he delivered to high school classmates and their parents in 2016. You can find it online through YouTube. Mangione went off to the University of Pennsylvania that same year, majoring and excelling in computer science, graduating in 2020 and then going to California to work as a software engineer. At some point between 2016 and 2021, Mangione's disillusionment with tech and more broadly with American society set in. In 2021, Mangione posted on Reddit a positive review of industrial society and its future, a radical and rather mad manifesto written 25 years ago by Ted Kaczynski, the so-called Unabomber, who warned that industrial and technological advances were destroying humanity. A word or two on Ted Kaczynski for those of you in the audience too young to remember, the Unabomber. In the 1970s, Kaczynski had abandoned a promising career as a mathematician to wage war on the industrial technological complex that he loathed. He became a recluse, living in a remote cabin without plumbing or electricity. There he taught himself how to build bombs. Typically, he sent his exploding contraptions through the mail, killing 3 and injuring 23 across a campaign that went on for nearly 20 years. The FBI finally identified Kaczynski as the bomber in 1995 and arrested him in 1996. A federal court sentenced him to life in prison in 1998. He died in prison by suicide in 2023. In 2021, Mangione wrote this on Reddit about Kaczynski's treatise. It's easy to quickly and thoughtlessly write this off as a manifesto of a lunatic. Yeah. But Mangione insisted Kaczynski was not to be dismissed as a crazy Luddite. Rather, he was to be seen as clairvoyant, able to discern patterns that others could not see. Mangione admired Kaczynski for having become what he called a political revolutionary. He quoted approvingly the words of another Reddit reviewer of Kaczynski's manifesto that praised Kaczynski for having, quote, the balls to recognize that peaceful protest has gotten us absolutely nowhere. When all other forms of communication fail, violence is necessary to survive. To what failures of political protest was Mangione referring? Those against the Iraq War? Those against the 1% by the 99%, the defining slogan of Occupy Wall Street? Those against racism and Black Lives Matter? Bernie Sanders' attempt to pull the Democratic Party in a leftist direction, blocked in March 2020 when the party's elite quickly fell in line behind Biden? The George Floyd protests in 2020 to uproot structural racism? We don't yet know, though we may find out if Mangione invokes a time-honored anarchist tradition as fellow Italian Sacco and Vanzetti once did, and succeeds in turning his criminal trial into a platform for broadcasting his political views. Stay tuned to that. What does seem clear is that Mangione's attraction to violence only intensified after he embraced the Unabomber in 2021. When Mangione was arrested in Altoona, Pennsylvania in December 2024, he had on him a notebook in which he began to scrawl justifications for his violent act. I do apologize for any strife or traumas I have caused, but it had to be done. Frankly, these parasites had it coming. Corporations like United Healthcare, quote, have simply gotten too powerful and they continue to abuse our country for immense profit because the American public has allowed them to get away with it. We don't yet have any evidence suggesting that Mangione had joined a radical group or that his attack on Thompson constituted a conspiracy that involved multiple individuals. But if Mangione acted alone, he was hardly a solitary figure in expressing anger at the sham he charged American democracy had become. Mangione's violent act drew a tremendous amount of popular support, especially from the ranks of TikTokers. Here's a sampling. One TikToker insisted that the murdered CEO of United Healthcare should not be described as an innocent and loving family man. This is a dude whose job it is to commit murder behind a corporate veil. They are wolves who want to kill you for your money. Another TikToker declared, it doesn't matter if Brian Thompson's assassination was moral or not. Violence is the predictable outcome of an irrationally cruel and violent system that prioritizes the profit of a few over the lives of many. Not only would I not turn in today's hero, announced a third TikToker referring to Mangione, I would Anne Frank him in my fucking attic. Welcome to the French Revolution, intoned a fourth TikToker, as though he were issuing a warning that the world of the ultra-rich was about to be turned upside down as it had been in 1789. How representative are these TikTok videos of broader sentiments among young Americans? One poll found that 45% of university students sympathized more with Mangione than with Thompson. Another poll conducted by Emerson College backed this finding up, revealing that among young Americans, more than 40% found Thompson's murder acceptable. 40% approval for the kind of cold-blooded murder that Mangione committed is actually shocking, providing additional evidence that among many young Americans, no longer believe that ordinary democratic channels of protest suffice. Declining confidence in American democracy is, of course, a symptom not an explanation for how the US arrived at this point. Some would argue that American democracy has long been troubled and that this current disillusionment is nothing new. The structural flaws of American democracy are plain for all to see. Here's a brief list. The Electoral College, which permits a candidate who loses the popular vote to become president. The disproportionate amount of political influence exercised by small rural states. The corrupting effects of unlimited amounts of private money pouring into political campaigns. Massive disenfranchisement of the sort that occurred during the Jim Crow era and that shows signs of reviving today. And excessive and biased power of the Supreme Court. But for most of American history, faith in democracy persevered. Many Americans continued to believe that their democracy could be improved, repaired, renewed. I'm not sure that such belief, such faith endures. If I am right about that supposition, then the current crisis in American democracy is of a more recent vintage. Where do we locate its origins? For me, they are to be found in the 1990s, and first and foremost in economic rather than political developments, specifically in an international economic system that became dominant at the time, what I have elsewhere called the neoliberal order. This economic system promised economic prosperity and security not only to all Americans, but to all the peoples of the world. It delivered that prosperity to some, but at the cost of convulsing the lives of others, stripping them of their jobs, their communities, and their hopes for a better future. When the economic convulsions became severe, as they did during and after the global financial crash of 2008-2009, democratic governments in the global north proved unable to deliver the necessary remedies. This broad failure of democratic government in the aftermath of 2008-2009, not just in the US, but in other liberal democracies of the global north, created an opening for authoritarian thinking and impulses to pass from the margins, where they had always resided, into the mainstream. Let me expound on the summary I've just given you. The neoliberal economic order became dominant in the US and the world after 1991, when the fall of communism in the Soviet Union opened the entire world to capitalist penetration to a degree not seen since prior to the First World War. The core ambition of neoliberalism was to release capitalism from regulatory constraints, abolish obstacles to free trade and the free movement of people, and power economic growth and prosperity everywhere. Its ambition was grounded in a belief that capitalism, released from constraints, would deliver extraordinary levels of economic growth. Its liberalism was not the social democratic liberalism of Franklin Roosevelt, but the classical liberalism of the 18th century Scottish economist Adam Smith. Release economic energies from constraints, and the wealth of nations would rise to extraordinary heights. This was a powerful and alluring dream. In the United States, both Republicans and Democrats embraced this vision, not just Ronald Reagan and George W. Bush, but also Bill Clinton, and even to a certain extent, Barack Obama. The neoliberal order delivered on some of its promises, most notably in raising up middle classes of ample size and security in broad swaths of the developing world. But the stimulation of economic growth in these countries often stripped it away from the global north. Between the 1980s and 2010s, countries in the global north hemorrhaged millions of manufacturing jobs to the global south, to the point where whole industries were hollowed out, as were the cities and regions in which these industries had once flourished. The declining fortunes of the working classes of the global north have been well documented. In the United States, intergenerational social mobility had been a hallmark of economic and social life since the 1940s, especially for white working class Americans. Children could expect to improve on their parents' educational attainment, labor force skills, and economic standing. As Roz, Chetty, and others have shown, these indicators of upward social mobility all reversed in the 1990s. The younger generations began falling short of their parents' achievement. By the 2010s, what the economists Angus Deaton and Ann Case have called deaths of despair, deaths arising from alcoholism, drugs, and suicide, began to soar among white, male, middle-aged Americans, triggering a historic reversal in life expectancy across this cohort. Despair was worsened among some by the perceived racial implications of the white working class's decline. The globalized world of free trade had not only stripped white workers of their jobs and prosperity, it also appeared to be handing those jobs and hopeful futures to people of color in China, Southeast Asia, and India. 100 years ago, W.E.B. Du Bois wrote that white workers had long benefited from what he called a psychological wage. By this he meant that white workers, however poor they may have been, occupied positions of privilege as members of America's white race. This rank did not ease their poverty, but it certainly, Du Bois argued, enhanced their status. The privilege of whiteness had long had an international dimension, manifest in the way that Europe and the United States had for centuries dominated Asia, Africa, and the Caribbean economically, politically, and culturally. The breakup of Western empires and the emergence of independent states across Asia and Africa in the decades after World War II eroded this domination. Nevertheless, airs of superiority lived on, so much so that many members of the white working class in the global North, even into the 21st century, had trouble accepting the reversal of fortune that was becoming manifest, namely that people of color in formerly subjugated and colonized lands were now prospering in ways that once privileged whites in Western countries no longer were. This reversal of fortune was evident not just from observations of the dynamic growth rates manifesting themselves in the faraway economies of China, Korea, Taiwan, India, Indonesia, and Brazil. It was also evident close to home where metropoles in the United States and Western Europe seemed to be filling up with people of color, the result of the relatively open border regimes that prevailed during the neoliberal heyday. A staggering total of 35 million immigrants came to the US between the 1970s and 2010s. In the United States, a black man with a Muslim name, Barack Hussein Obama, assembled a multicultural political movement in 2008 strong enough to send him to the White House. Many whites in America thus feared that they were not simply losing the economic competition with lesser peoples defined by race and/or religion, they were also losing the ability to sustain their nation's long-standing ethnoracial character. Declining economic fortunes and democratic eclipse went hand in hand, generating a tidal wave of fear among whites that their families and nations were being stripped of their future. Trump rode this wave to the White House in 2016, pledging to halt and then reverse what he called in his memorably notorious phrase, American carnage. Making America great again was never just about economics. It was always also about race. The pain of economic decline then was compounded by the perception that whites were being stripped of their racial privileges. Increasingly, those experiencing economic decline and what they came to call racial replacement blamed their suffering on a global elite. No democratically elected legislature had the wherewithal or courage to control. These globalists, as both the former Trump advisor Steve Bannon and historian Quinn Slobodian have called them, were getting immensely rich from globalization even as substantial parts of their countries of residence were rotting. This global elite was seen not just as an economic or political threat, but as a cultural threat, as they were thought to delight in the mixing of cultures, peoples, and sexualities that came to characterize the metropoles of the global economies. Members of this elite were seen to smirk with barely disguised contempt at countrymen and women who preferred more traditional lifestyles marked by ethnic and religious homogeneity, by heterosexuality, and by the conviction that when God created the world, he made a gender binary, the one distinguishing Adam from Eve, foundational to it. Anger and resentment spread across the real and metaphorical countryside. Its residents feared that globalists were using elements of the latter's radical, or woke as it's now known, cultural agendas. When economic disaster struck this neoliberal world, as it did during the financial crash of 2008-2009, the globalists, in the eyes of their critics, made sure to take care of their own people first, persuading governments to bail out banks and restore confidence in stock markets while leaving ordinary citizens who had lost their jobs and homes to fend for themselves. Those ignored in the bailouts began to believe that the financial elites had burrowed their way deeply into states, corrupting governments profoundly, ordinary politics no longer sufficed. Too many parties and political leaders had been co-opted. National parliaments seemed unable to solve the problems that a globalized, capitalist, and free trade world had generated. Citizens erupted in rage in country after country, their anger imbued with a hard right tinge, often coalescing around a strong man, a very strong man who promised to smash through all obstacles, political, economic, and cultural, to set things right. The decade following the financial crash witnessed hard right populist revolts in country after country. Consider this partial inventory of these uprisings. The Tea Party in the US in 2010, the ascension of Viktor Orban in Hungary, 2010, the rise of the National Front in France, 2012, 2017, the election of Modi in India, 2014, the Brexit uprising in the UK, 2016, the election of Trump in the US, 2016, and the election of Bolsonaro in Brazil, 2018, all in the decade after the financial crash. But wait, some of you might be thinking, why assume that disgruntlement, even discussed with the global elites in their penetration of parliamentary bodies, would benefit only the right? Why couldn't that disgruntlement benefit progressives and the left, or simply liberals? Were there not left progressive political uprisings in the chaotic second decade of the 21st century? Indeed, there were. Many, in fact. Consider this partial list. Tahrir Square, Cairo, 2011. Occupy Wall Street, 2011. Black Lives Matter, 2014. Podemos in Spain, 2015. The rise of Bernie Sanders in the US, 2016. The rise of Jeremy Corbyn in the UK, 2017. The massive umbrella protests in Hong Kong, 2019. The George Floyd rebellion of 2020. I would add to this list the center-left coalition that propelled Joe Biden to the presidency in 2020. All these movements were robust and seemed at the time of their appearance to be consequential. They were consequential. In fact, if we were to stop the historical clock in 2011 or 2014 or even 2020, we might judge these protests of the center-left to be more consequential than those of the populist right. Yet we now know that most of these center-left movements have not had the staying power of populisms of the right. The George Floyd moment in the US is over, as is the Jeremy Corbyn moment in the UK. Podemos has vanished. The left in France, Germany, and Italy is in deep disarray, and the center-left hopes that accompanied Biden's assumption of the presidency have, for the time being at least, been extinguished. Why is that so? I'm not sure. End of talk. No. But I'm really not sure. In this, the last part of my talk, I will offer you some preliminary answers as to why the right has soared far more than the left. I will welcome your own thoughts. I implore your own thoughts on this critical matter in the Q&A, because I don't feel like I have fully figured this out, and it is one of the most urgent questions of our time. But here are some stabs at an explanation. First, progressives are seen by hard-right populists as allies of the despised neoliberal globalists in one important respect. Both groups valorize cosmopolitanism, diversity, and open borders. Both groups are seen as delighting in the mixing of cultures and the hybridity and syncretism that results from such mixing. Both groups are seen as slow to defend the integrity of nations and the ethnoracial or ethno-religious character thought by conservatives to lie at every nation's core. The attack on cosmopolitanism takes multiple forms. The most powerful identifies immigrants as threats to the economic and cultural well-being of nations. The right has addressed these concerns clearly, though cruelly. Nations, the right wing insists, must build high and impregnable walls to keep out all but the choicest migrants. Liberals in the left, by contrast, have had trouble demonstrating that their cosmopolitanism and humanitarianism can yield immigration policies that are effective and popular. The confusing and fumbling signals about border policy sent out by the Biden administration constitute a good case in point. Put simply, on immigration matters, majority of citizens in most countries of the global north trust the right more than the left. This hostility toward immigrants, in my view, expresses fears not just about the present, but also about the future, when refugee flows triggered by climate catastrophe will dwarf those convulsing nations today. Most progressives in the US and elsewhere have yet to formulate a policy that, in the hands of majorities of citizens, address these fears. Anti-immigrant sentiment tends to well up from below. The right in America, however, has also benefited from a second political development of equal consequence, this one emanating from above, from those who inhabit citadels of economic power. In the United States, the defection of the tech billionaires from the Democrats and from democracy itself has been particularly important in this regard. In 2016, many of the wealthiest and most powerful figures in and around Silicon Valley either opposed Trump or reluctantly supported him. By 2024, that elite opposition had melted away. One tech lord after another now demonstrated an eagerness to bend a knee to Trump, with several making personal pilgrimages to Mar-a-Lago to do so. Their support mattered nowhere more conspicuously than in Elon Musk's decision to spend $280 million of his own fortune on Trump's re-election campaign and to use his Twitter X social media platform as a megaphone to broadcast Trump's virtues and Kamala Harris's defects to his 200 million plus followers. In their own tales of conversion to MAGA principles, these tech billionaires frequently invoked their unhappiness with the so-called wokeness of the Democrats. It is well known that Musk blames wokeness for his son's decision to become a trans woman and to cut off all communication with their father. Or to take another example, that of Mark Andreessen, tech entrepreneur, internet founder, and billionaire venture capitalist. Andreessen has complained that political correctness among his employees made the task of managing the workforces of his various companies unbearable. But equally important in the tech lord's conversion to right-wing politics was something else, namely the Biden administration's determination to impose on them a regime of public regulation that they had never experienced before. In the 1990s, Bill Clinton had worked hard to pass legislation that freed the tech sector from virtually all public regulation. Clinton's disposition was true to the neoliberal argument, dominant at the time, that the IT revolution would flourish best if market forces were allowed to work their magic free of government guidance or intrusion. The Biden administration broke with that neoliberal creed profoundly. It attacked corporate privilege and power across a broad front. It sought to level the playing field between workers and their employers by supporting efforts of unions to organize workplaces. This pro-union disposition especially angered Musk, who was doing everything in his power to keep the United Auto Workers out of his Tesla production plants. Lena Khan, Biden's chairperson of the Federal Trade Commission, launched a major antitrust campaign against Amazon while developing a regulatory framework to make sure Microsoft and Google's ventures into AI were compatible with the public interest. Biden's Justice Department, meanwhile, filed an antitrust suit against Apple, alleging that it was using its monopoly in the smartphone industry to strangle or buy up innovative competitors. Through Gary Gensler, head of the Securities and Exchange Commission, the Biden administration was attempting to tame the wild west of cryptocurrency and to insulate the traditional financial sector from its potentially harmful impacts. This multifaceted effort to rein in high tech exasperated Mark Andreessen, prompting him to explain upon leaving one meeting with senior White House staffers, "Oh my God, they're going to kill us. They're going to kill our companies. We are no longer dealing with rational people," meaning the Biden administration. Only Trump, Andreessen now believed, could protect him and other tech lords from this onslaught. In the month after Trump's election, Andreessen, who had voted for Democrats for most of his life, spent half his time at Mar-a-Lago assisting the president-elect's team with his transition back into power. Was Andreessen concerned that democracy might suffer under a Trump administration? Not so much. In a recent interview, Andreessen mused about how good it would be for America to install a monarch, someone like Trump, who in Andreessen's words would, quote, come in and like take the thing by the throat. The thing being America's political system. As has been the case with several major figures in the tech world, Andreessen has taken on the shadowy figure of one Curtis Yarvin as his Svengali. Formerly a software engineer based in San Francisco, Yarvin had gained underground fame around the time of the 2008-2009 financial crash as a web blogger writing under the pseudonym Mencius Moldbug. He had a good sense of humor. Yarvin developed a philosophy that he came to call neo-reaction. Many of his followers were so mesmerized by his vision of the future that they took to referring to Yarvin as our prophet. They admire him not just for his clairvoyance, but for the courage he displayed and his willingness to borrow language from the Matrix, as many of them did, to take the red pill. Yarvin sees democracy as generating only instability and chaos and as undermining any nation's chance of greatness. In an analysis that owes a great deal to the theorist of the managerial revolution, James Burnham, Yarvin argued that American democracy broke down in the 1940s, its place taken by a bureaucratic oligarchy, which also failed to govern effectively. America's only choice in the 21st century was either to continue to be governed by a sclerotic bureaucracy or to appoint a skilled monarch with the power to whip the government and then the country into shape. Yarvin's preferred monarch was not one cut from the sorry cloth of Charles III, sorry Charles, the UK's reigning but emasculated monarch. No, Yarvin declared only, quote, absolute monarchy would do. His monarch was to be gifted with what he called, quote, unconditional personal authority, subject to some responsibility mechanism, such as a board of directors chosen by the monarch himself. This king, he imagined, would use his power to enact a total regime change. Such a thoroughgoing transformation might require punitive action in the short term, but in the long term, Yarvin imagined that his monarch would create an economic and political environment in which all the king's subjects could flourish and maximize their wealth and personal liberty. 20 years ago, Yarvin was on the margins, his ideas mere drops in the blogosphere sea. But in the last 10 years, he has acquired a large and energetic following, which includes some very powerful individuals. Yarvin's ties to Peter Thiel, founder first of PayPal and then Palantir, go back a long way. The two men share a conviction that America must abandon its democracy. Thiel is a trusted advisor, both to Trump and J.D. Vance. Andreessen considers Yarvin a good friend. So does 2020 Arizona Republican senatorial candidate Blake Masters. Yarvin has connections as well to Steve Bannon, Elon Musk, and Michael Anton, just appointed as the State Department's Director of Policy Planning. This formidable group now has their man, their would-be monarch in the White House, and unlike 2016, they have a plan. How to start implementing this plan? As early as 2012, Yarvin came up with this idea: retire all government employees, 2012. He liked to call it by its acronym, RAGE. The description of a monarch coming to power, sacking the federal bureaucracy, and concentrating all power to himself seems like a pretty good description of what Trump, Musk, and their coterie seem to be after. American history is full of captains of industry, of plutocrats, of so-called robber barons, wanting to maximize their power and to free themselves from public regulation. But rarely has a section of the American economic elite been as frank as the current one in expressing its desire to end democracy in America, to repudiate the notion of that the people should rule, and to treat the separation of powers, so central to the country's constitutional design, as a programming error. The constitutional crisis is not something that is coming to America. It is here. I need a drink. In conclusion, what is to be done? You will help me with this in a few minutes. First, we should not be complicit in a very broad campaign, visible not just among Republicans, but among Democrats, to consign the Biden presidency to the dustbin of history. The Biden project, really a collaboration between the center and left of the Democratic Party, believed that the vast economic inequalities of the neoliberal era would have to be reduced if America were to regain its promise. Private capital would have to be put under a regime of serious public regulation. This conviction underlay Biden's desire to be seen as the second coming of Franklin Roosevelt. He wanted to find a way to harness capitalism in the 21st century so that it would serve rather than upend the public interest. Andreessen's declaration that they're going to kill us, they're going to kill our companies, distilled into one exasperated cry, the fear that the Biden project instilled in the tech lords. The Biden administration threatened the privileges of the tech industry in ways in which no previous administration had done. The stakes of this power struggle were and are high. Would private capital or the public interest prevail? The Biden presidency, despite passing important legislation, did not succeed in selling its project of disciplining capital to the American people. Why not? Was Biden just too old? Too lacking in his capacity to demonstrate vigor and to inspire? Yes. Did COVID-era inflation hurt? Absolutely. Did Musk's $270 million, 355 private airplane flights in the year prior to the Trump inauguration, and command of Twitter provide Trump with the 270,000 votes he needed in 3 states to eke out his razor-thin victory over Kamala Harris and to deny the Biden project the second term it desperately needed? Quite possibly. But here's another possibility, one that few have considered, namely that the problem with the Biden administration was not that the president was too old, but that his political project was actually too young. It was too young, too unfamiliar to America and Americans, having been birthed a mere 5 or 10 years before he took office in 2021. Historically nascent progressive movements in the US have struggled for decades and have suffered multiple defeats before acquiring a stable institutional basis and enduring power. World War I killed off the first progressive movement, much as we may one day point to the COVID epidemic, a trauma comparable to the trauma of war, as having killed off the Biden project. Yet the original progressive movement, defeated in 1920, returned as the New Deal 12 years later. Perhaps the green shoots of progressive governance that broke through the political soil during the Biden years will flower, and do so sooner than we think, in the 2030s. If that future is going to have a chance of materializing, citizens in America who still believe in democracy must fight like hell to preserve the integrity of the 2026 and 2028 elections. The key strategy of today's authoritarians, as Harvard political scientists Steve Levitsky, Daniel Ziblatt, and others have shown, is not to eliminate elections, but to rig them so that the governing party always wins. Viktor Orban has been deploying this technique in Hungary to great effect. Several of Trump's key advisors have been ardent in their desire to Orbanize America. Once the electoral system has been corrupted in this way, ejecting authoritarians from office becomes far more difficult. Finally, Americans who have lost their faith in democracy must find a way to get it back. As I've tried to suggest in my remarks today, this loss of faith runs far deeper than most of us have acknowledged. It is present among Republicans and among Democrats, among the poor and among the rich, among radicals, conservatives, and reactionaries. It has facilitated Trump's rise and return to power. It is not my job to tell you how to reclaim that faith. Inevitably, a resurgence of faith must be accompanied by plans to reform American democracy. It must include a full reckoning with the times and places when democracy in America has failed to deliver on its promise. It will require new strategies focused both on the electoral arena and on social movements that lie beyond it. But reclaiming faith is essential. not simply for building a better future, but also for getting through America's authoritarian present. Thank you very much. I would like now to invite Beverly Gage to join me on the podium for some conversation.
Let's do it. Just to remind you all, we're going to talk for a few minutes here, and I already have many questions that have come in, so I'm going to try to distill those down once we've had a chance to chat a little bit. So, Gary, I was furiously taking notes and asking questions when I wasn't sinking into despair from your lecture there, and since we're both historians, I thought we might start out by looking a little bit at the past and at past moments that I think might give some context, many of which you already mentioned. So one that I have been thinking a lot about in recent days is the Gilded Age. And that is partly because, so that's the period in the late 19th, heading into the early 20th century. Trump has been indicating this may, in fact, be the moment he's always been referring to when he says we're going to make America great again. We seem to be having some energy around that, and William McKinley is back in the news for the first time. But I guess I wanted to get your reflections on the Gilded Age, maybe thinking about Luigi Mangione, right? The Gilded Age was a period of mass immigration, vast inequality, concentrations of economic power in the hands of a very few individuals in the midst of an industrial revolution, a time of tariffs and corruption and violence in American society. And it produced two responses. One was, as you were suggesting, a response that came from the left in terms of mass organizing, particularly around labor. And then this is really the birth of what I think is being dismantled at the moment, which is the birth of some sort of administrative state, some sort of effective federal government that was going to even this out, cater to the needs of the American people. But then you also had another reaction, and that reaction was, by the 1920s, immigration restriction, actually on a level that's not on the table right now. I don't think anybody's talking about immigration restriction of that sort. You had the Ku Klux Klan basically taking over the Democratic Party for a while. You had a massive repression of civil liberties during the war. So I guess I want your reflections on the Gilded Age, but hasn't this process of action and reaction gone hand in hand in American history? Are we really at as unique a moment as you seem to be suggesting?
Oh, great question. The Gilded Age and the Progressive Era has a lot to teach us and to reflect on. And certainly the crises of that era were as momentous as the crisis of today. But what I see in that period is a confidence and hope both among liberals and the left. This was at the dawn of we might call the working class century, the communist century, the sense of a left having a message of emancipation for the working class, of transforming the world. And I think some of that optimism, some of that hope, and some of the confidence of liberals has been lost. One of the favorite terms that among academics today is to talk about the polycrisis afflicting us. And if you think about what is the polycrisis, it's that we have so many crises today that we can't possibly get a handle on them. There are just too many of them. We smite one down and another one rises up to smite us back. I would like to get rid of the term polycrisis. It's not a new phenomenon. What's new is a confession of weakness in the face of very serious problems that these are problems that can't be solved. Now, there is one very good reason for being pessimistic today, and that is the impending reality of climate catastrophe. That is something that the early 20th century people did not face. But if we look at the number of crises that were affecting America in the late 19th and early 20th century, robber barons, you've mentioned extreme inequality, huge numbers of immigrants, higher proportionately than today, deep, deep cultural split between the two Americas, the trauma of war. The crises are not more numerous today. They were just as numerous and perhaps more numerous then. But the confidence of the reformers was much greater than the confidence of reformers today. And that is one point, that does mark this moment as different. The other part of this that's different is there's never been a figure like Trump in the White House. The closest probably is Andrew Jackson, but Andrew Jackson knew and respected the Constitution in ways that Trump does not. There have been plenty of figures like Trump in American history. There's no shortage of demagogues in American history. But the political system worked to winnow most of these people out by the time they got to the competition for the top prize. And so we are dealing with a president and a circle around him who I would say are more explicit than any other presidential regime in America to dispense with the limitations that the Constitution has imposed on politicians in America. So I would say that is another factor that is new and fresh.
All right, well, that takes me to a second historical moment I wanted to talk a little bit about. You were focusing a lot of your talk on the 1990s, but the decade that was very much on my mind in listening to you was actually the 1970s, partly because the 1970s, like this moment, was a period of polycrisis, right? We had Watergate, we had the end of the Vietnam War, a whole series of other economic crises and economic pressures. It's really the decade that gives birth to this narrative, which has been going on for a very, very long time now, about the disillusion of the white working class with conventional Democratic Party politics. It was the Reagan Democrats then, right? We have, I think, a much fuller transition now. But pieces of this story have been going on for a long time. And I guess when I think about the 1970s, I think about it as a moment of a kind of anti-institutional turn that happened on the left as well as the right, a kind of turn on American liberalism that's been playing out for a long time. I think that anti-institutional turn happened a lot more powerfully on the left during that decade. And then I also think about the political reforms of the 1970s and the fact that I think if we hadn't had those crises of the 1970s, when people on the left and the right were both arguing that there was too much consensus in American political life, and what you really needed were two polarized ideological parties, and that was really going to give everyone a choice, and that was going to solve American politics. These were real ideas. Some of you may remember thinking these things at the time. One of the things that came out of that was the primary system that we have, which is now a popular, pretty unbounded primary system that, in fact, I think is what gave us Donald Trump and allowed someone with no real roots in the political system to come in from the outside. So again, just your reflections on the 1970s, and I guess particularly the kinds of political changes that were set in motion then, and whether they have made this moment more or less possible.
Well, I do think that the major moments of reorientation in American life over the last 100 years have come out of economic crises. It's true of the 1930s, it's true of the 1970s, and it's true of the first decade of the 21st century with the financial crisis. And so I think these are moments that are rooted in economic crisis that profoundly shake up political arrangements and cause people to think differently about the kind of politics and political reforms that are necessary. I think in one way Trump is new. On the other hand, I would say Americans have been fonder for a much longer period of time about people, presidential candidates with little experience in politics, uncorrupted by politics, riding in to save the nation, a kind of purity standing above politics. I think this begins with Andrew Jackson. I think there's a bit of Abraham Lincoln in this as well. So I think the tradition of outsiders coming into American politics to shake things up has a deep cultural appeal and speaks to the suspicion that Americans have long had that American politics corrupts. And certainly this was on people's minds quite intensely in the 1970s. But I would frame the long-term crisis, I think, somewhat differently. And that has to do with a burden that America's had, which has gotten more intense over time. And that is the inadequacy of an 18th century constitution to govern a modern 21st century society, and the impossibility of changing that constitution because of the high bar that the founders set for making any kind of change. There's no doubt that in order for America to get the big state that it did, the liberal jurists, first the Roosevelt Court and then the Warren Court, had to stretch the Constitution in various ways. And their reasons for doing so were reasons I support, but constitutionally problematic. And what America, I would say, really needed in the 1970s and 80s is a constitutional amendment that would have legitimized the broad exercise of centralized government power. That never happened, and the 1970s were the first decade of rebellion against that. It's the birth of the conservative legal movement, people being upset about what was regarded as the too liberal interpretation of the Constitution by the Warren Court. And conservatives and Republicans have battled for decades to take that state down, first trying to do it by constitutional means, which failed again and again and again. Grover Norquist, one of the leaders of this movement in the 1990s, said, I want to shrink the size of the federal government until I can drown it in a bathtub. And part of what we see in terms of extra constitutional behavior on the part of many political figures today is rooted in their own sense of frustration that we can't restore America to what it should be. And this becomes a justification for supporting someone who was willing to deploy extra constitutional means. So I would say the legacy of the 70s is more to be found in the frustration of conservatives in terms of their ability to do this through normal political means, which is what has made them far more open to doing this by extra constitutional means, even if that means seriously eroding or undermining the constitutional basis of the republic.
There's several questions in here. I'm going to turn to some audience questions now. There's several questions in here trying to make sense of your analysis of neoliberalism, figures like Elon Musk, and this kind of white working class voter that you laid out, which is to say, I mean, isn't Elon Musk, I mean, aren't the tech lords kind of neoliberals in and of themselves? Sort of, how is this alliance going to hang together? Does it actually make sense? Do people who voted for Donald Trump actually want Elon Musk? And did those things appear to go together? But I guess sorting out these categories, because in fact, it doesn't seem like a natural fit. And in a lot of ways, this doesn't look like a reaction against neoliberalism. It looks like a kind of hyped up neoliberalism, to the degree that that was about the emphasis on the private, about choice, about individualism, about pushing back against the collective, about dismantling the government. And so I think there were just a variety of ways of phrasing this in here. But how do you sort out those categories?
With difficulty. Certainly, there's a libertarianism among the tech lords that recalls a neoliberal heyday of wanting to be freed from all constraint to do what they want to do. But the neoliberal order was a global project involving the entire world that saw a role for the state in terms of regularizing rules of trade, commerce, laws of the sea, respect for national sovereignty, that there had to be a code, there had to be an edifice of law, international law. WTO is an expression of that, to make sure that the system was working effectively. And what is being, I think, possibly torn up now is that commitment to an international rule of law that was designed to protect the interests of what we might call the capitalist class and the elite, and a kind of cowboy mentality on the part of Musk and Trump and others that we don't need these laws. So on the one hand, it's a libertarianism, neoliberalism on steroids, but it's sacrificing a legal framework where one of the principal architects of neoliberalism, Friedrich Hayek, considered essential for its success. And so it risks a kind of lawlessness, power politics, domination of the strong over the weak, which the neoliberal order wanted to achieve, but it wanted to achieve it through legal means. This current administration, if it continues along this path, is threatening a lot of that and substituting it with something else, which is might makes right. Now, as the other part of this, what do the tech lords have in common with white workers? How do they bridge the class divide? Well, Trump had a lot of promises in his campaign that he was going to make life better for ordinary workers in America economically. There's no sign yet of him delivering on those promises. And that makes the cultural campaign they're waging, the campaign against wokeness, the campaign about emasculating men by promoting white men, not promoting white men, by emasculating white men by promoting people of color, by promoting women, by promoting a different way of organizing the society that deprives white men of their older privileges. We saw this in the tremendous support that Trump received from young men, not just among white men, but for the first time penetrating into the districts of Latino men and black men, attracting levels of support among them that have not really been achieved before. So there's a struggle to reassert masculinity in a world in which these white men see a process of emasculation happening over the last 20 or 30 or 40 years. And one of the manifestations of this is the podcasting world. It's one manifestation of this, which is heavily dominated by white men, unapologetic about their aggressive masculinity. Another manifestation of this is the world of worldwide wrestling, which Trump has always been deeply involved with, and which celebrates and has celebrated for years and decades a kind of macroaggression as a way of life. And it has struck me how ironic it is that in so many places that I inhabit, there's so much concern about microaggression, which is a term common in universities. Whereas in these other districts, what is being celebrated is a macroaggression and the reassertion of a traditional masculinity of the crudest, most dominating sort. This becomes a mechanism, I think, of deflecting attention from what's not actually happening on the economic front. The dividend is being paid in culture. It's another version of Du Bois's psychological wage. You can delight in being a member of the fraternity and the brotherhood, and that will compensate you for your continued poverty as a member of working class America. As to the question of will the alliance between Musk and Trump last? Is the world big enough for the two of them? You're saying no? One theory is that it should have broken up already. But I think, anyone who comes close to Trump's orbit ends up getting burned by Trump. I mean, it's an incredible capacity he has. It's hard to find a person who's come into a close orbit with him and has exited that world better off than when they came in. I mean, Rudy Giuliani is probably the best example of that. Now, it is true that I think Trump is a bit intimidated by the sheer size of Musk's fortune, and that's going to cause him to keep him closer for a longer period of time. But I think Musk is serving a very useful purpose for Trump. Let Musk do all the work of raging, R-A-G-E, retire all government employees. Let that be his project. Give him a long leash. And if he hangs himself by that, Trump can come in at a later date as a savior and just cut that off and play the role of the hero once again.
So you brought up the culture war aspect of what's going on right now. There are a lot of questions about structural power, whether constitutional checks and balances are even going to hold in our moment. Lots of talk of trying to measure exactly when we're going to be in a constitutional crisis. You know, there are the camps that are still watching. There are camps that say it's already here. And then, of course, there are camps that say, don't worry about it. It'll be great when it comes. But universities. So here we are. There's several questions in here about the role of universities as targets of attack in this moment, as forces in American culture, one way or another. These, of course, aren't particularly new in American history, but they seem heightened in this moment, and they seem to be about to have real consequences. I wonder what you think. As a professor at Yale, I have in this moment often thought, though, we've got one plan here, but I've often thought, is it better if I just keep my mouth shut for a while, right? Like anything said by a university professor at almost any place is taken to be delegitimizing by vast swaths of the population in this moment, rather than legitimizing. But what do you think about the current state of universities in this moment, their future, their past, and kind of what we should be expecting?
Well, the universities are under attack. And it's important that we see this, part of what I try to convey in my talk, by bringing in the struggle between Biden and the tech lords. This is a struggle for power. And the struggle between the right and the universities is a struggle for power. The right has been very systematic and very clever about the long march through the institutions. They've taken a page from Mao. If you want to be successful, be prepared for the long march. And neoliberals were in the wilderness for 30 years. Their ideas first appeared in the 1940s, didn't matter. 1950s, didn't matter. 1960s began to matter with Milton Friedman. But it was really not till the 1970s and the economic crisis of that moment that they began to flourish and begin their successful march through the institutions. The universities, so you think of the way that Trump and MAGA has conquered the Republican Party. You think of the immense consequences of that power struggle. Through the alternative media, through social media, through Elon Musk, they have made a real dent in the media, which they see as a hostile force to MAGA, and now there are alternative medias which are competing and, in fact, outstripping legacy media in terms of influencing millions of Americans. The universities are one institution that have remained outside their sphere of power. And they have now targeted the universities as, in a sense, not just the universities, but the medical districts, the scientific districts. These are immensely powerful formations in American society. We have to realize the power that they have, that we have, and we have to organize to defend that. And ultimately, that can't happen by simply keeping our heads down. I can't remember whether it's Tim Schneider or Masha Gessen who has warned against what they call anticipatory acquiescence, a fear that you will be next. And so the best thing you can do is to keep your head down. I think this is a time that universities have to get their act together, and they have to do so in multiple ways. We need university presidents to speak out in defense of universities and speak out loudly. We have to find a way not to repeat in the near future the terrible divisions that convulsed Harvard and many other institutions last year for understandable and comprehensible reasons. Those issues have to be discussed, but there also has to be a strategy for bringing the different parts of the university together around common themes and purposes. And I also think the universities have to do a better job than they have done of selling their mission to the broader American public and to find a way of crossing the chasm that now separates us from a very large section of American society that sees us as being up to no good. And this is the kind of project that each of us involved in universities has to begin with, and it needs to be a discussion that goes on internally, but then it has to have external ramifications. Let us understand the power that universities and the scientific community have, and let us begin to think about how we can begin to organize both to defend the values on which universities are based, but also to find ways to reach a public that has become very skeptical and often antipathetic to what it is we do.
All right, we have time for one more question, and it is going to be along the lines of, what do we do? Which seems to be, I would say, 90% of the questions in the feed here. But in particular, I think there's a way in which a politics of crisis, a language of crisis, certainly the strategies of what we've seen in the last few weeks, which is this kind of barrage of action, the poly-crisis you talked about, that can be a very disempowering language, right? A crisis is overwhelming, people are panicked, people are reactive, and it seems to me that that's a natural response to a moment like this, but that actually, change happens over a much longer period of time. It happens through really thinking about good strategy, the tools that are available, whether it's universities or elsewhere, and beginning to not just be in a reactive pose, but to imagine something else. that might be possible. So we'll just finish with the small question of what do we do? What's the right strategy? But no, what's your best case scenario, maybe? But any of those that you want to finish with here.
I should turn it back to you and have you answer that question. I think we all have to struggle. I'm not as concerned about the initial sense of submission and acquiescence that has characterized the last few months. I think in 2016, it really did seem like a rogue event, and this cannot be happening to America. This is not America. Now we know this is America, and we need to take some time to figure out how to build a better America back. And I think the struggles are emerging. There was a town hall with a conservative congressman in Georgia that he was overwhelmed by, the anger that was being expressed there. There are federal workers mobilizing. I think the struggles are beginning to appear. Let them develop. The strategies of the Trump administration are so aggressive and so radical that they may create a crisis in the near-term future, collapse in stock market values, people beginning to realize they're going to lose benefits they count on if Social Security cuts are made part of a legislative package. I think it's incumbent upon each of us to struggle in the arena in which we live and to seek out other people and to begin to form groups to discuss this and to figure out strategies of going forward, beginning a process from the bottom up. I think it's also important to begin to talk frankly about American democracy again, and if I'm right about the deep disillusionment that a lot of Americans have with democracy, we have to figure out a way to get that back. I think Kamala Harris was not wrong to focus on the democracy issue in her campaign. The question we have to answer is, how do you get Americans excited about restoring their democracy? And that's a project of education, of discourse, of public discussion, and it's also a discussion of strategies. I think for especially younger people to really begin to believe in democracy, they have to believe that there's some concrete results that are happening. And here, we haven't talked about this at all, but part of the crisis of the current moment is the complete abdication by Congress of its responsibility as a key institution of American governance. And I think we have to talk about what does it take to restore that? What other reforms in American democracy are necessary to put it on a healthy footing? And then it's always been the case in periods of crisis that social movements emerging outside of the formal political arena become incredibly important. It was true of the labor movement of the 1930s. It was true of the civil rights movement of the 1960s. People taking to the streets, people assembling in protests, people making their voices heard in unconventional means. Historically in America, the political system has been very hard to move and to change. And the biggest changes have not been accomplished by simply voting, putting people in office. It's been accomplished by social movements happening outside the electoral process that put pressure on the institutions of government to respond to them. I mean, MAGA is a great example of it's not just a political movement, it's a social movement. What would it take to have a MAGA movement of liberals in the left that could match that intensity and have that kind of impact on the Democratic Party that it's had on the Republican Party? I think that's where we have to start. And let me just give one note of optimism, since there's been a lot of pessimism in my talk, and it refers to your point about the 1920s. 1924 Democratic Party Convention. Democratic Party is as deeply split as it is split today. You had the northern voters, Catholics, Jews, Orthodox Christian faiths, urban, wet, which means they like to drink. You had Al Smith being their nominee. And on the other hand, you had Southern whites, evangelicals, religious conservatives, believing in the literal truth of the Bible, supporting the KKK. The 1924 Democratic Party Convention went 103 ballots, 10 days in an unair-conditioned Madison Square Gardens in July. Al Smith was representing the urban north, William McAdoo, Woodrow Wilson's nephew, representing the white south. Finally, on the 103rd ballot, they gave up and nominated John Davis, a nondescript corporate lawyer from West Virginia, who got absolutely crushed in the general election by Calvin Coolidge. A lot of people thought the Democratic Party was finished. Who was a man who put Al Smith's name in nomination? A man by the name of Franklin Roosevelt. First appearance on the public stage after his crisis of polio. He must have been looking over that convention and saying, they have no future, I have no future. 8 years later, Franklin Roosevelt was elected president of the United States. 12 years later, he had one of the most resounding victories in the history of American politics. Things change in America. And the note I want to leave you on is be prepared for the long march, which may end up not being so long. And it has a short-term component, the absolute imperative of protecting the electoral integrity of the 26 and 28 elections so that their outcome is not foreordained. But beyond that, be prepared for a struggle that's got to take some time, but that may ultimately yield an America that we can be proud of, once again. Democratic, caring, just, where the rule of law and a better degree of economic equality has been restored.
Thank you, Gaddis.
I want to say thank you to Gary and to Beverly for that extraordinary conversation, and particularly for ending on a note of optimism. We appreciate it. And thanks to all of you for your questions. They were excellent. For those of you who are with us in person, I want to invite you to a brief reception downstairs on the first floor of Knaufel. And to all of you, I want to say, please go to Radcliffe's website to hear about upcoming events. I want to put on your radar the Kim and Judy Davis Dean's Lecture on March 6th with the celebrated author, Celeste Ng. Please join us and have a wonderful evening. Thank you.